When someone has a passion for what they do, it comes through in the product they provide their customers. Just ask LaRocco's Pizza's new owner, Jason Johnson, about their crust. They make it every day and let it rise for a minimum of 24 hours before they use it for their pizza. And his staff doesn't want to do anything they won't be the best at, and you can taste it in their pizza. LaRocco's Pizza, just a half block north of the I-470 and Gage Boulevard exit. Come taste the difference.
It's the season for brand new mulch, and Brown's Tree Service has got your yard covered. Brown's Tree Service utilizes hardwood mulch that retains more moisture. Not only does mulch make your yard more appealing, it also reduces weeds, improves soil, and creates insulation for plants. Get the right mulch for your job at Brown's Tree Service. They shred it, haul it, and spread it in bulk. Or you can haul it yourself for the personal touch to your property. Call Brown's Tree Service at 785-379-9212 or visit online at brownstreeservicelc.com.
It's time for Real Estate 101 with the Carrie Brown team from Preferred Advisors.
Good Saturday morning to you. This is Carrie Brown, Associate Broker with eXp Realty and the Preferred Advisors team, and you're listening to Real Estate 101. I am back again this week with my co-host for the month, Mr. Scott Sexton of the Law Office of Scott Sexton. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great.
So I caught Scott in the car today, so if we have any feedback, that's what's going on. But really excited to have you on. So last week we talked about power of attorney and, different things that you should be doing to make sure that if you are not capable or, say, out of the country or, later in life, that your power of attorneys are what you need them to be for. This week we're going to be talking about several things, but we're going to start off with what are ways to make sure that your home is considered homestead and how that plays into Medicaid if you should have to go into long-term health care. So, Scott, take it away.
All right. Well, I get probably more questions about a person's home than any other asset, especially when it comes to long-term care planning. And one of the questions I get asked all the time is, well, can't I just put my kids' names on the deed, or should I just give my home to my kids, or should I co-own my home with my family members that I trust to inherit the home? And at first blush on paper, it sounds like that would be a great idea, because if you were to pass away, the kid would be an owner with rights of survivorship and could stand to inherit the home, and that would be a great way of being able to avoid probate. Unfortunately, there are some unexpected or unintended consequences of putting your kids' names on your home. And one of the first problems that you're going to run into is that simply putting a person's name on the deed doesn't necessarily provide you with any protection when it comes to Medicaid or long-term care planning or VA planning, because oftentimes that type of addition to the deed will be viewed either as a non-event under VA, if you're looking at VA pension benefits. The VA does recognize adding a family member as divesting any interest in the property. And then for Medicaid planning purposes, the state of Kansas will oftentimes do one of a couple of things. One possible outcome, and the one that you really want to avoid, is they'll sometimes interpret that as a gift. So if I add my son's name as an co-owner of the home, I have made a gift that is therefore subject to penalty under the state's Medicaid rules. And so if I had to go into a nursing home less than 5 years after adding a family member's name to the deed, then that could disqualify me for Medicaid benefits. And then when I ultimately pass away, if Medicaid wants to put a lien on the home, they can come back and collect against the equity in the home potentially, and ultimately, even though my son's name is on the home, he might not be able to get the full value of the home, or even a fraction of the value of the home in the long run. So adding someone's name to a deed doesn't give you the protection or safety that you think. And then to kind of pile on to that notion, the other problem that you can run into is if you try to sell the home during your lifetime, there may be capital gains tax issues because you're selling half of the value of the home from a who doesn't have a homestead exemption on that property. And so there can be capital gains issues on that portion of the sales. But there are lots of problems. So the question is, well, is there a solution when it comes to just It really depends on what your goal is. If you want to protect the home for planning purposes because you're looking at long-term care, in my experience, the most successful tool is the proper kind of trust planning or gifting planning plus time. Here in the state of Kansas, we have a 5-year look-back rule, so that if I were to gift an asset, say, into a planning trust or to a family member, then if I waited 5 years before I applied for Medicaid benefits or Medicaid insurance benefits, or 3 years for VA pension benefits, then I'm able to have that transfer go without the state coming in and penalizing me for having made that transfer. So that's one option. If my concern is just avoiding probate, and this is typically a concern that younger and healthier families have, where we're not looking at needing a nursing home or skilled care of any kind in the near future, and we're just looking at avoiding probate, there is actually a very affordable and simple tool that you can use to make sure that your home passes non-probate without causing the tax problems I mentioned earlier by adding a family member to the deed. And the simple solution here in the state of Kansas is something called a transfer on death deed. And this is a very simple type of deed that any attorney that does estate planning or elder law planning should have no problem getting you in that type of a deed in place. It's simply a designation that says on your deed, if I pass away, the person that I want to have inherit my property. And for that reason, because it's such a simple and effective and relatively affordable document, for younger and healthier individuals, it's the first thing that I will recommend if you're wanting to do some estate planning. I would look at that before I would look at a will. The mistake a lot of people make when it comes to estate planning is they think that the will is the way that they can avoid probate, when in fact all a will really is it's an invitation to probating your estate. So
okay, so what would you do? Obviously, having a will would be important, but what is the best way to keep somebody from contesting it?
The best way to avoid someone contesting a will and dragging your family into court is to avoid the will altogether. A will is simply a set of instructions for a probate judge to inform them on how to distribute assets after you passed away. And when it comes to an estate plan, I'm an estate planner, and I myself don't have a will. And the reason I don't have a will is that I have all of my assets set up to pay automatically upon my death. So if I pass away, my retirement accounts, I'll say if Scott passes away, his accounts go to his surviving spouse. In this case, my wife, Wendy, inherits automatically. And the same for her accounts. They pay out to me automatically.
So you've set those up through the bank, correct?
That's exactly right. I've with my financial advisor, with my wife's financial advisor, with our banks, and with the county through our deed for our home, it's all set up payable on death. So we don't have to have wills. It all pays out automatically.
So what about things like, say, for instance, a mortgage that's already paid off? So your house is paid off. There's not really a bank to say, hey, this is what I want to have happen here. How would you address that?
Well, as far as the home or an account at the bank?
Well, as far as transferring that upon death, but is there any way to contest that if that's how you have it set up?
You can contest designations for transfer on death, but only if a person with an interest. So let's say I had everything set up to be payable on death to my daughter, and if my wife and I pass away, everything is set to go to my daughter. My son finds out that everything is going to his sister on death. He doesn't like that. He would be able to contest that by showing any number of things that could challenge that. The big ones being fraud or lack of capacity. These were changes that were made because my sister manipulated my parents into having me removed. She told them a lie, and they bought in this lie. As a general rule of thumb, challenging non-probate transfers like that, unless you have a smoking gun, and it has to be a really compelling smoking gun, you're going to have an uphill fight to challenge non-probate transfers. It's just not an easy fight to have. And the same thing applies really to wills. However, because a will is required to be probated, we've already opened the door for families having a discussion fights in court. So because we had to file a will, we're going to be sending it around to all of the interested family members. We're telling them when we're going to be in court, and we're giving them a time and a date that they can come complain in front of the judge. Because we're going through that legal process, everybody that could possibly have a complaint is given that opportunity to make that complaint. Unfortunately, everybody loses. It's an expensive process if families really want to fight it. Whereas with non-probate transactions, the invitation really isn't there, or it's just not as easy to contest those matters. And so if you want to avoid a probate fight, you just don't go through probate. You avoid it by setting up non-probate designations.
So back to that. So layman terms, non-probate transactions, or designations, how would you go about doing that if it's not a bank account or a savings account or investments?
The home is the most obvious one, which is in the state of Kansas, you can file what's called a transfer on death deed, which is a special type of deed that simply names beneficiaries to your home if you were to pass away. It is a non-permanent designation, meaning that you can go back and revoke that later on by simply filing another transfer on death deed. To file something like that, I would encourage you to speak to an attorney experienced with estate planning or elder law issues. They'll be able. It's one of the most basic and readily available options when it comes to the toolkit of an estate planner. So anyone that does estate planning work should be able to quickly whip up a quick transfer on death deed for a person. So that's one example. For other personal items, things can get a little tricky. So if you have very specific wishes about personal effects, about your wedding bands, about family photo albums, furniture, personal possessions like that, yes, a will could be useful in distributing that. However, again, keep in mind that you're going to be spending significant amounts of money to have attorneys and judges manage the distribution of that property. So unless you have a large volume of very valuable items that you don't want your family to fight over, or that there might be financial incentive to fight over, it makes more sense, in my opinion, assuming that your family is reasonable and adult behaving enough to cooperate, it might make more sense to simply write everyone a letter, have a lengthy description of assets, and instruct the family on what you want to have happen. Now, if you're concerned that there would be disputes amongst those family members, a better option might be to look at a trust. A trust is a good kind of catch-all way of distributing assets non-probate. A trust, think of a trust kind of as a Tupperware container that can hold the rights to just about any type of asset. There are some strange exceptions in the periphery, but you could put bank accounts in a trust, you can put a home in a trust, and you can put all sorts of personal property items in a trust and then just write those instructions of the trust. So it depends on the extent and detail of control you want to put into it. A lot of families I've found, they're content to just have personal property items just not addressed, or give very basic instructions as a part of a letter or notes in a trust to their family about how they want those distributed. But if you have strong feelings, certainly talk to an attorney about that and find out what types of options are available.
Would it make sense to go ahead, like, let's just say furniture, you've got heirloom furniture that you want to pass down to certain children? Would it make more sense just to go ahead and do that prior to, if you know that there's a time where you're going to have to go into a home or whatever? Would that make more sense? Is that something that could be argued about later?
Yeah, especially with sentimental items of personal property, I think that I'd like to encourage my clients to have those conversations with their family, especially if they're already thinking about transitioning to a care facility. Rather than putting everything in storage, it makes a lot of sense to make lifetime gifts. So if that's something that you're comfortable with, I always encourage lifetime gifts. And then if you're not comfortable with that, certainly making detailed lists of assets and where you would like for them to go it's definitely worth it, having those conversations with your family members so that they have honest expectations while you're healthy enough to be able to give them your 2 cents on it. I would rather my kids know ahead of time what my wishes are so that they're not left guessing and then thinking that they're in the right, knowing that this is what mom or dad would have wanted, and then perhaps having a mistaken thought on that. Better that we have those conversations now than after I'm incapacitated.
Absolutely. We're going to take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. We're going to come back and talk more about this subject. Thanks for listening to Real Estate 101. We'll be back in just a few.
Southwest Topeka has a good neighbor. State Farm agent Jim Garrison, now at 29th and Urish. If your current insurance situation has you going around in circles, get off the roundabout and stop in and meet Jim and his wonderfully efficient staff. Let Jim Garrison give you a quote and make the Garrison comparison. He's confident that with State Farm's competitive rates, the right coverage, and his unmatched service, you'll want to make him your new insurance agent. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there, and Jim Garrison is there for you, northeast of the roundabout at 29th and Urish.
When someone has a passion for what they do, it comes through in the product they provide their customers. Just ask LaRocco's Pizza's new owner, Jason Johnson, about their crust. They make it every day and let it rise for a minimum of 24 hours before they use it for their pizza. And his staff doesn't want to do anything they won't be the best at, and you can taste it in their pizza. LaRocco's Pizza, just a half block north of the I-470 and Gage Boulevard exit. Come taste the difference.
At SportsMomsUnited.com, we celebrate every athlete and support every sports mom. SportsMomsUnited.com is on a mission to put logic back in youth sports. When you ask young athletes why they play sports, their number one answer is fun. For them, that means being on a team, making new friends, having a good time, all of which are awesome memories. We add to the memories by featuring an athlete of the day and sharing their story. Nominate an athlete today at www.sportsmomsunited.com.
Thanks for listening to Real Estate 101. This is Carrie Brown, Associate Broker with eXp, and I am back with my co-host for the month, Scott Sexton from the Law Office of Scott Sexton. Prior to the break, we were talking about trusts and homesteads and wills and things along those lines. And the question to basically, listening to what you've described, a trust appears to be the most logical way or the cleanest way to separate all your assets without having to worry about your kids fighting later. Not that they can't still fight, but not taking it to court and consuming a bunch of, money or just the overall funk of doing that in a family. Is that correct? Would you say that a trust is easiest?
Well, not necessarily. And one other thing I would add into that equation is not just the simplest solution, but also kind of the most cost-effective one. What can I do that's going to cost me the least in the short term and in the long term? And the example I like to go to kind of illustrate this point is what I've seen families that get revocable living trusts, what ultimately happens to those types of cases over the long haul. So husband and wife come into the attorney's office, say in the late 90s, early 2000s, and they tell the attorney they want to avoid probate because their mom, dad, brother-in-law, whoever went through a messy probate after they passed away. We want to avoid that. So the attorney says, well, the cleanest, simplest way of doing that typically is a revocable trust. And as a general rule of thumb, I don't have any objection to that advice. However, nobody's finances stay static. After, let's say, 20 years, so that family, they set the trust up in the late 90s, early 2000s, it's now 2020. and the family comes in, and I'm having a review of their case with them. Over the past 20 years, that family has probably gone through 4, 5, 6 vehicles. They may have moved once or twice. They have opened and closed financial accounts. They've changed financial advisors because one of their financial advisors passed away unexpectedly. They've maybe changed jobs, and so they have multiple IRA or 401k accounts. The list goes on and on about all the different financial changes a family can typically go through over the course of 20 years. And that's just a small snippet of their lives. The problem with trusts is that while they do a great job of getting those results when they're properly funded, as soon as you start living life and your finances change and evolve, you have to be on top of those changes with your attorney typically in order to keep the trust updated over time. So you may spend a significant amount of money setting your trust up, and then you've got to spend a couple $100 here and there every time you have a change in your finances. And so there's an added expense of staying on top of that trust. Now, what I have witnessed in my own practice that happens all too often is people will fall into one of two categories. Either they will continually get trust updated like their attorney tells them to. They'll constantly have meetings a couple times a year with the attorney to keep the trust updated, and then the attorney starts billing them, and they grow weary of that over time, and they ultimately end up spending a lot of money on maintaining that trust like they need to. The other side of the equation, which is the far more common one, is after the first couple of years, the family stops updating the trust like they should, and their finances continue to evolve over time. 20 years go by, and then suddenly mom or dad pass away. They come to the attorney, and the attorney finds out that they've got half of their estate outside of the trust and now subject to probate because they didn't stay on top of all those tiny changes that needed to be made to move assets in or out of the trust over time. And
the question here would be, how old should you be, roughly, assuming you're in good health, for all your 40s and 50s? How old would you say you should be or consider looking at doing a trust?
Correct me if I'm wrong. Let me throw this out as an alternative way of answering that question. I think that it's more helpful to look at a person's life as sort of a generic timeline, and there are different legal fits, I think, for different phases of a typical person's life, and unfortunately none of us are typical. But let me run you through a quick, the way I conceptualize the timeline for a person's life and see if that answers your question maybe a little bit better. So person who is relatively young, they're perhaps looking at getting married, maybe having young children, someone from the age of 18 up through middle age, those types of individuals, I would encourage them to have a will put in place if they have really strong feelings about their children or having their children inherit from them. In case of an emergency. They should probably have a simple will and talk to a financial advisor about settings, or not a financial advisor, excuse me, a legal advisor about setting up a simple will to handle those. Typically, younger people don't have the volume of assets. They have much more debt, and so a will is perfectly fine for someone, in my experience, up to about the age of 40, along with a good power of attorney. From age 40 through 65, this is kind of an in-between gray area. You can be just fine setting up your accounts with payable on death designations, beneficiaries on your accounts. That's what I do. I have some simple instruction for what happened to my minor children, what their inheritance rights are, things like that. Again, talk to a legal advisor about that. Anyone 65 years of age or older, this is when I really feel we need to start having the discussion about significant trust work. And the reason for that is twofold. On the one hand, it helps to kind of put the pieces in place to avoid probate, to make things simpler in case husband or wife pass away and their spouse inherits everything. We want everything organized so that there's not a whole lot of work that needs to be done to restructure anything. But more importantly, I like the idea of introducing the notion of planning trusts to a family 65 years of age or older. This is something that you were hinting at earlier, and we talked a little bit about last week. By setting aside assets in a trust while I'm young and healthy, if 5 years, if 3 years, if any number of years pass, I can start to protect and exempt those assets. And the asset that is the most important to protect is a person's home. And the reason for that is that the home is typically the asset that I see in the majority of my cases that has the most value and volume. And it's also the asset that potentially has the most tax pitfalls tied to it. So if I sell my home and I have significant appreciation of value there, I want to make sure that I'm avoiding or minimizing capital gains tax. And if I don't take the right moves with my trust, I can accidentally lose those exemptions. And if I, again, don't make the right moves with my trust and I needed long-term care, I may have thrown away my equity in my home, again, my most valuable of all assets.
Going back to the will, so what you're saying, if I'm understanding this correctly, is a will is better when you're younger. A trust is better when you're older. And then making sure that your bank accounts are... you have it to where your spouse or whomever is able to take over that account after you've passed. And that your home is, whenever you do that, you have it transferred upon death. Am I getting all that correct?
Correct. And of course, everyone's situation is unique and different, and there are any number of permutations that could be important in your case. But generally speaking, again, the younger you, I would say at all ages, it's extremely important to have a really good power of attorney, of course, but the younger you are, the more likely you are to get away with just a simple will, perhaps instructions on what you want to have done with your minor children, and payable on death. Middle age, you can lean more heavily on just payable on death designations and a good DOA, and then later in life is when you really want to be looking at benefit planning, long-term care planning, and that's where trusts come in as almost a must.
And that's assuming that you have a home and you aren't big into investments and things along those lines. But let's say you were. Let's say that you have a pretty broad portfolio of investments, even real estate and other items. Would you say that a trust is the best way to go with that?
I would say yes. If you have a significant portfolio, again, in my experience, significant portfolios also come kind of hand in hand with very specific wishes and instructions. Folks that have $10 in the bank don't really care what happens to the $10 if they pass away so much, whereas someone with, say, $5 million, they have a lot of priorities of what they want to have happen with those assets if they pass away. So while yes, there is I would say that there is a correlation between having more and getting more out of your trust. In my experience, it usually is because the person who has more usually has more decisions they want to be making with those assets. And so the more decisions that you have that you want to put in place, then the more important it is to have either some trust planning or long-term care planning, things like that. At the same time, though, I would say that a person with $5 million in the bank, typically that they're more likely to have an attorney who's gone through the estate planning than a person with $5,000 in the bank. And so the wealthier individual, their attorney typically my observation has been their attorneys are more likely to have advised them to use Medicaid planning trusts or long-term care planning trusts as a way of setting those assets aside so that they can easily qualify for Medicaid, whereas someone who has far less in the way of assets, they might not be necessarily seeing an attorney as often as a person who's wealthy. And so those of us with far less money in our savings accounts, because we're not getting that regular legal estate planning advice, are much less likely to have those trusts. But ironically, the person with less money is the one who would benefit more from that long-term care planning. And here's what I mean about that. If I had $5 million in the bank in cash, and I was asked to pay a $5,000 a month assisted living bill, that's going to be nothing to me. It's going to be far less impactful than if I only had, say, $60,000 in the bank, and my bill was $5,000 a month. I've only got 12 months' worth of assets to be able to pay my bill, and so for me to protect and qualify my estate for Medicaid is much more important the less money I have. So the more money a person has, the more likely they are to have appropriate planning trusts. But the less money a person has, the more important that it would be that they have that type of planning in place.
So be sure and listen next week. We'll talk about this some more. Thanks for listening to Real Estate 101. If you're looking to buy or sell, be sure and give me a call at 785-213-5188. Check out our website at preferredadvisorsteam.com. And Scott, how would they get a hold of you?
You can get a hold of me here in Topeka at 785-221-4062, or you can reach my assistant Kelly at 785-409-5228.
Thanks for listening to Real Estate 101.
Thank you for listening to Real Estate 101 with the Carrie Brown team from Preferred Advisors.